Brayden Walker was down to his last $40 when he paid for her lunch. He hadn't planned to eat out that day. He'd been dragging his 4-year-old daughter, Sophie, through the crowded food court at the downtown mall after her preschool let out early. She wanted chicken nuggets. He wanted to cry, and he didn't have the energy to argue after working a double shift at the garage. But then he saw her, the woman in the navy blazer at the register, digging through her expensive-looking purse with growing panic on her face. Her long dark hair was tucked behind one ear, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Around her wrist clung a thin gold bracelet that looked real, not costume, but her hands were shaking like she was about to cry. "I swear, I had it when I left the office," she was saying to the teenager behind the counter, who looked more annoyed than concerned. Brayden didn't think. He stepped forward, Sophie's tiny hand still wrapped around his fingers. "I got it," he said, sliding his card across the counter before she could protest. "Add hers to mine." The woman blinked at him, stunned. "Wait, what?" "No. You don't have to, it's fine," he said quickly, keeping his voice casual. "Looks like you're having a rough day. It happens." He could feel her staring at him as the card reader beeped. He wasn't sure what made him do it. Maybe it was the way her voice cracked just slightly, or the way her shoulders had dropped when the cashier huffed like she was holding up the line. Either way, it felt right. Even if it meant he'd be eating ramen for dinner again. "I'll pay you back," she said quickly, following him as he led Sophie to the nearest table. "Seriously, just give me your info. I lost my wallet somewhere in the building, but I can wire it to you. Or Venmo. Or, I don't have Venmo," he said, tearing open the ketchup packet for Sophie. "And I don't want your money." She frowned. "But you just paid for me." "It was a sandwich," he shrugged. "Not a car." She sat across from him without being invited. Up close, she looked expensive. Not flashy, just polished. Her blazer wasn't just navy, it was tailored. Her heels were sleek and probably cost more than his rent. But her eyes were soft, and she was staring at Sophie with a kind of gentle curiosity. "I'm Zariah," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Zariah Hayes." "Brayden," he replied, then gestured. "And this is Sophie." Sophie was too busy dipping fries into her milkshake to care, but Zariah smiled anyway. "I really do want to repay you somehow," she said. "That was kind." Brayden leaned back in his chair. "You don't have to. Seriously. Just pay it forward or something." Zariah tilted her head, watching him. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who can throw money around." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not. Trust me." "That was supposed to be our dinner money." Her expression shifted. "Then why did you do it?" Brayden looked at her, really looked at her. "Because you looked like you needed someone to not make it harder." She went quiet for a moment. Then, a small smile tugged at her lips. "Would it be weird if I asked if I could buy you dinner sometime? You know, to return the favor." Brayden blinked. "Wait, you're asking me out?" "I'm asking you to let me say thank you," she said, her tone playful but sincere. "And maybe, yeah, I'm asking you out." He looked down at Sophie, who was now playing with her chicken nuggets like they were action figures. "I don't really date," he said slowly. "I've got Sophie full-time. Her mom's not in the picture." Zariah nodded, her smile not fading. "That's okay. I'm not asking for anything complicated. Just dinner." Brayden hesitated. He wasn't used to women like Zariah. She looked like she belonged in a city boardroom, not in a mall food court with a grease-stained single dad. But something about her made the world feel lighter. Like maybe not everything had to be a struggle. "All right," he said finally. "Dinner." Dinner turned into a rooftop Italian place 2 nights later, her pick. When he arrived, he nearly turned right back around. The place had a valet, a dress code, cloth napkins, and a wine list that looked like it needed a translator. He'd worn his nicest jeans and a button-up that didn't have any grease on it, but he still felt like he didn't belong. Then she walked in, Zariah in a sleek black dress, her dark hair in soft waves, heels clicking against the marble floor like music. And when she saw him, her smile lit up like she actually wanted to be there. "You came," she said warmly, sliding into the seat across from him. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "This place is fancy." She laughed. "It's just dinner." But it wasn't just dinner. She didn't talk about money or brag or ask him invasive questions about his job or his past. Instead, she asked about Sophie, what she liked, what bedtime books they read. She asked about his work, and he could tell she actually listened. He asked her what she did, and she just said consulting, brushing it off like it wasn't important. You're kind of a mystery, he said partway through the main course. Zariah lifted a brow. How so? You dress like a CEO, but you talk like a teacher. And you're eating lasagna with a guy who couldn't afford the appetizer. She leaned forward, her eyes serious. I'm eating lasagna with a guy who paid for a stranger's lunch when he didn't have to. That's not nothing. After dinner, she walked him to his car instead of calling a driver. She didn't mention the valet. Didn't flinch at his beat-up sedan. Before he could open his door, she stepped closer. I meant what I said, she murmured. You're different. Brayden swallowed. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's good, she said, and then without waiting she kissed him. It was soft. Slow. Not rushed. But it sent something through him that made his knees weak. When she pulled back, she smiled. I'll call you. He nodded, stunned. As he drove home, Sophie asleep in the back seat from the sitters, all he could think was, what just happened? He had no idea that Zariah Hayes wasn't just a woman in a nice dress. She was one of the most powerful billionaire tech investors on the West Coast, and she just kissed a struggling mechanic with a 4-year-old daughter and $40 to his name. Brayden didn't hear from Zariah for 3 days. Not that he expected anything. He'd spent the whole drive home convincing himself he'd imagined the kiss, or that maybe it was one of those polite, end-of-date things that didn't actually mean anything. By the second day, he was scrubbing brake pads while half wondering if she'd changed her mind. Maybe she'd realized he wasn't interesting enough, or wealthy enough, or whatever enough to fit into her world. Not that he even knew what her world was. But then came Thursday afternoon. He was elbow-deep under the hood of a truck, the summer heat turning the inside of the garage into a furnace, when Luis's boss poked his head through the office door. Brayden, he called, waving something. Some fancy delivery guy's looking for you. Brayden wiped his hands and stepped outside, where a man in a crisp gray suit stood beside a sleek black car that looked like it belonged in a movie. He held a flat white box tied with a dark ribbon. You Brayden Walker? The man asked. Yeah. He handed over the box without another word, then turned and got back into the car. No explanation. No note. Brayden stared at the package for a second before opening it. Inside was a dark blue envelope with his name written in clean, elegant handwriting. And beneath it, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a pair of front-row tickets to the Philharmonic's Summer Gala at the Westbridge Theater, an evening concert known for drawing the city's elite. The note inside read, Friday, 8 o'clock. I'll meet you there. Dress code, sharp. No name. But he didn't need one. Luis whistled low. That's $1,000 night right there. You got a secret life I don't know about. Brayden stared at the tickets. Apparently, I do now. He didn't own anything that qualified as sharp. But that night, after Sophie was asleep, he called in a favor from one of the guys who'd been a groomsman at his cousin's wedding. 2 sizes too big and a little dated, but it worked. He had to roll the cuffs and pin the waist, but standing in front of the mirror, he looked almost like someone who belonged at a gala. Friday night, he dropped Sophie off with his neighbor, who watched her when he picked up the occasional night shift. Then he drove across the city, heart pounding harder the closer he got to the theater. The Westbridge was lit up like a dream, marble pillars soaring into the sky, strings of white lights wrapped around the grand staircase. Guests stepped out of town cars and limousines, dressed in gowns and tuxedos, glittering like stars. Brayden parked 3 blocks away to avoid valet and walked the rest, feeling like a fraud with every step. He was about to turn around when he saw her. Zariah stood beneath the marquee, wearing a deep plum dress with a single shoulder strap and heels that probably cost more than his entire car. But it wasn't the dress or the hair or the fact that people were glancing at her like they knew her. It was the way she looked at him, like she was actually happy that he came. You clean up well, she said as he reached her, her eyes flicking down his suit with a smile. I borrowed it, he admitted, adjusting the cuff. I figured if I was going to crash a gala, I should at least look like I tried. You're not crashing, she said. You were invited. They entered together, her hand slipping casually around his arm. The theater lobby was a sea of elegance, chandeliers glittering overhead, champagne flutes balanced on silver trays. It felt like walking into another world. Once they were seated center row, perfect view of the stage, he leaned toward her. Zariah, he said quietly, how did you even get these tickets? She looked at him for a beat, then turned back toward the stage. I have a few connections. That's not an answer. I'll give you one later, she said, voice low. But for tonight, just enjoy the music. The concert was breathtaking, an evening of strings and symphony, the kind of performance Brayden never imagined he'd see in person. But even as the orchestra soared, he kept glancing sideways, drawn more to the curve of Zariah's profile than the stage. After the final bow, she led him down a side corridor instead of toward the exit. "Where are we going?" he asked. She didn't answer until they stepped through a glass door onto a private rooftop terrace overlooking the city. There were candles, a small table set for two, a bottle of wine already chilling in a silver bucket, and a view that made Brayden stop in his tracks. "You planned this?" "I asked them to set it up," she said casually, walking toward the railing. "I figured we'd skip the post-concert crowd." He followed her out, stunned. "This looks like something from a movie." She turned, her expression softer now. "I wanted to see you again, but I didn't want it to be small. Not this time." They sat. A server appeared briefly to pour the wine and place two covered plates on the table. The food looked like art, delicate, precise, delicious. Brayden took a bite, then looked at her across the flickering candlelight. "So," he said, setting down his fork, "you going to tell me who you really are?" She didn't flinch, didn't dodge, just nodded slowly. "My family's in tech investments," she said. "Mostly legacy portfolios. I took over managing the private arm about 6 years ago. I'm technically the CEO now." He stared at her. "So you're not just in consulting. You're running the whole thing." "Yes. And this," he gestured to the rooftop, "the view, the wine, this is normal for you?" "It's not about normal," she said. "It's about what matters. And right now this does." He leaned back. "You know I'm a mechanic, right? I live in an apartment with a leaky ceiling and a kid who thinks peanut butter is a food group." "I know exactly who you are," she said softly. "And I've thought about you every day since the food court. Not because you fixed something, not because you tried to impress me, but because you didn't." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Why not someone from your world? Some other executive with a private jet and a country club membership?" "Because none of them looked at me like I was a person," she said. "You did." The silence stretched. Then she added, "And because when I lost my wallet, you didn't ask what I could do for you. You just helped." Brayden looked down at his hands, then back at her. "This is a lot," he said. "I know. I don't know if I fit into your world." "I don't need you to fit into anything," she said. "I just need you to be who you are." He exhaled, looking out at the skyline. "Sophie's my world. That's the only thing I can promise." Her voice didn't waver. "Then I'd like to meet her." He looked at her, surprised. "You mean actually meet her?" Zariah nodded. "If we're going to keep doing this, I want to know every part of your life." Something shifted then. Slowly, like the ground beneath them was becoming more solid. Brayden raised his glass. "Then here's to the most unexpected week of my life." Zariah clinked her glass against his. "And the start of something neither of us saw coming." By the time Zariah knocked on Brayden's apartment door the following Sunday afternoon, he had cleaned the place twice and rearranged the living room 3 times. Sophie was in her favorite overalls, hair in 2 uneven braids he'd done his best with, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a stack of picture books. When the knock came, Brayden paused with his hand on the doorknob. "You ready?" he asked Sophie. She nodded, still flipping through a book. "Is she bringing snacks?" He chuckled. "Not sure, kiddo. Let's find out." Zariah stood in the hallway holding a small paper bag and a cautious smile. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair in a loose twist, no makeup except maybe a hint of gloss. She looked entirely different from the woman who'd kissed him under candlelight on a rooftop. And somehow, just as striking. "Hi," she said, holding out the bag. "I brought cookies." I wasn't sure if she had allergies, so I made oat and banana. Brayden stepped aside. "You made these?" "Baking helps me think." As she stepped inside, her gaze swept over the modest space. The couch had a visible tear near one armrest. The kitchen counter bore a stack of unopened bills. But none of it seemed to faze her. She crouched down to Sophie's level. "You must be Sophie," she said, offering the bag. "I heard you like stories." Sophie eyed her, then took the bag and peered in. "Are there raisins?" Zariah smiled. "Nope. Just bananas and oats." "I don't like raisins." "Neither do I." That earned a small nod of approval from Sophie, who pulled out a cookie and took a bite without further questions. Zariah sat cross-legged on the carpet beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. Brayden leaned against the wall, watching them, arms crossed. "You're good with kids," he said after a minute. "I had a niece who lived with me for a while," Zariah replied. her gaze still on Sophie. My sister passed away when her daughter was 6. I took care of her until she finished high school. That's a big thing to take on. Zariah met his eyes. So is being a full-time father. They didn't speak for a moment. Sophie flipped a page, then looked up. Want to read one? Zariah didn't hesitate. Sure. Brayden stepped into the kitchen, more to give them space than anything else, and busied himself making coffee. He listened to Zariah's voice weaving through the words of the story, occasionally pausing as Sophie interrupted to explain a character or add her own version of what came next. By the time they reached the 3rd book, Sophie had curled up beside her like they'd known each other for months. After an hour, Brayden walked her to the door. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, one cookie still clutched in her hand. You didn't have to stay that long, he said, keeping his voice low. I wanted to. He hesitated. That niece of yours, is she still around? She's in college now, studying environmental policy. Zariah's expression shifted, something unspoken behind her eyes. Sometimes I forget she's not that little girl anymore. Outside, the sky was dull with late afternoon clouds, the hallway empty. Zariah lingered by the door. I'm going to be in Chicago for a few days, she said. There's a board meeting I can't miss. Brayden nodded. You fly out tonight? In the morning. She glanced back toward the couch. I'm glad I came. He hesitated, then asked, Does anyone in your world know about me? No, she said honestly. Not yet. He nodded. That's probably for the best. Maybe, she said. But I don't want to hide you, Brayden. I just want to make sure I'm doing this right. He studied her. And what does right look like for someone like you? Her voice was quiet. It looks like this. Showing up. Listening. Not assuming I know what you need. He reached for her hand instinctively. I don't have a lot to offer you. You already gave me something I don't get often, she replied. A place where I don't have to be anything but myself. They stood like that, just holding each other's gaze, until she finally leaned in and kissed him again. Slower this time. No rooftop. No candles. Just the scent of warm cookies and the sound of a child breathing softly in the background. When she pulled away, her palm lingered against his chest. I'll call when I land. He nodded. Be safe. She turned and walked down the hallway, and he watched her until she disappeared around the corner. That night, after putting Sophie to bed, Brayden sat on the couch with one of the leftover cookies in hand. He stared at the blank television screen, the apartment quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He hadn't planned on any of this. Not the gala. Not the rooftop. Not the way Zariah looked at him like he mattered in a world where he was used to being invisible. And certainly not the way his daughter had curled into her side like she'd known her forever. He didn't know what came next, but something had shifted. Deeply. Irrevocably. He wasn't just the guy who'd paid for a stranger's lunch anymore. He was the man a billionaire had chosen to find her way back to herself. Brayden hadn't expected the knock on his door at 7 in the morning, especially not the morning after Zariah was supposed to land in Chicago. He opened it in pajama pants and a t-shirt, with Sophie clutching his leg and yawning against his hip. Zariah stood there with 2 paper cups of coffee, wind-tossed hair, and a look in her eyes that made his stomach flip. I didn't go, she said, stepping inside as he moved aside. You didn't go to Chicago? I got to the airport, sat in the car for 20 minutes, and realized I didn't want to be there. She handed him one of the cups. So I canceled the flight and came here. Brayden blinked. You canceled a trip across the country because you didn't feel like going? No, she said, setting her bag on the counter. Because you and Sophie are more important than a room full of men who think I'm only valuable if I keep making them richer. Sophie tugged on his shirt. She can stay for pancakes, right? Zariah bent to meet her at eye level. I'd love to. Brayden set the coffee down, still processing. You're just here now, not just for breakfast, she said. I'm here because I don't want to keep living 2 lives. I've been doing that for years. I thought it made me safer, but it's also made me lonely. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms. You're not exactly someone who fades into the background. I've spent a long time making sure I did anyway. Even when I was in rooms where I had the loudest voice, I never felt heard. Brayden glanced toward Sophie, now busy rummaging through a kitchen drawer for pancake mix. You feel heard here? I feel seen here, she said, even when I don't say anything. Later that morning, after Sophie had gone to play in the courtyard with the neighbor's little boy, Brayden sat beside Zariah on the worn couch, the sunlight striping across the living room floor. I don't know what this is turning into, he said quietly. She looked at him without flinching. Neither do I. But I know what I want it to be. He turned to face her. I can't give you a penthouse or a house in the hills. She touched his knee gently. I already have those. What I don't have is a life that feels honest. This life with you, and Sophie, it's the only place where I'm not performing. Brayden swallowed hard. You're not afraid it's too complicated? I'm afraid of what happens if I walk away from the only thing in my life that feels real. They sat in quiet for a while, the sounds of children's laughter drifting in from the open window. That evening, she brought them to her world. Not the public one, the real one. She drove them to a quiet house on the edge of the city, nestled behind tall hedges and old trees. It wasn't a mansion. It was an older home with ivy on the brick and warm light in the windows. Inside was a grand piano, bookshelves filled with titles in multiple languages, and framed photos of a girl who looked like a younger version of Zariah. This was my sister's, she said, setting her keys on the entry table. I kept it after she passed. I come here when I want to remember who I was before the world tried to tell me who I had to be. Sophie wandered through the hallway, stopping at a painting of a fox in a meadow. Can we sleep here? Zariah crouched beside her. Only if your dad says yes. Brayden looked around the room. It felt like a memory wrapped in warmth and time. Is there enough space for us? There's always been space for you, she said. That night, Sophie slept in a guest room with a handmade quilt and stuffed animals that had belonged to Zariah's niece. Brayden and Zariah sat outside beneath the maple trees, wrapped in a blanket with a bottle of wine between them. I've been shutting people out for so long, she said, her voice low. Even the ones I love. I think I forgot what it's like to let someone in. You picked a complicated guy to start with, Brayden said. She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. No, I picked the right one. The next morning, she made breakfast while Brayden helped Sophie build a castle out of pillows and books. Zariah's laugh echoed through the kitchen like it belonged there. Like it always had. The day after that, she took Brayden and Sophie to an art exhibit that hadn't opened to the public yet. The curator greeted Zariah by name and handed her a private tour pass. Brayden raised an eyebrow. You're full of surprises. I'm not trying to impress you, she said as Sophie darted ahead toward a sculpture of a glass tree. I'm just sharing my life with you. All of it. By the end of the week, Brayden had stopped waiting for the moment it would all fall apart. On Saturday, Zariah asked him to come with her to a benefit gala. Not as a date. As a partner. I want them to see you, she said. Because you're part of my life now. He hesitated. I don't have a suit that fits. You will, she said. I took care of it. The suit arrived later that day, tailored perfectly, with a dark tie and a note stitched discreetly inside the collar. You belong. At the gala, the cameras flashed. People stared. Some whispered. Zariah never let go of his hand. When the chairman of the board approached with a thin smile and a patronizing glance, she introduced Brayden without hesitation. This is Brayden Walker, she said evenly. He's the man I love. Later that night, back at her sister's house, she found him on the porch, staring at the stars. You really said that, he murmured. I meant every word. He turned toward her. You're not afraid they'll try to tear it down? They can try, she said. But I spent years building a fortress. What I want now is a home. Brayden took her face in his hands, brushing his thumbs over her cheeks. You already have one. Right here. With us. She kissed him, not like it was a beginning, but like it was a promise kept. The next morning, he made pancakes while Sophie danced around the kitchen in socks that didn't match. Zariah sat at the table with a mug of coffee, watching them like she'd finally arrived in the only place that mattered. There was no more pretending. No double lives. Just a man who'd paid for a stranger's sandwich when kindness was all he had to offer. And a woman who had everything except the one thing she found in a mechanic's apartment, a reason to stay. The scent of fresh paint still lingered faintly in the air as Brayden carried the last box through the front door of the craftsman-style house tucked into the quiet, tree-lined street in Marlow Heights. Behind him, Sophie danced through the entryway, holding a stuffed rabbit in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other, her sneakers squeaking against the polished hardwood floors. Which one's my room again? She called, spinning in a wide circle. The one with the yellow curtains, Zariah answered from the kitchen, where she was unpacking a crate of dishes with sleeves pushed up past her elbows. The sunniest one in the house. Just like you asked. Brayden set the box down beside the couch and turned to look at her. Her hair was tucked into a loose braid, strands falling around her face as she leaned into the cabinet. She had traded her heels for soft flats and designer suits for linen and denim. And yet, she had never looked more herself. He walked over and reached for a plate she was trying to set on a high shelf. "You're going to hurt yourself reaching like that." "I'm not as fragile as I look," she replied, handing him another plate. "You're still not tall enough for the top shelf." Zariah leaned her hip against the counter and watched him finish. "We made it," she said softly. "Yeah," he said. "We really did." After the gala, after she'd introduced him publicly without flinching, things had moved quickly. Not because they were rushing, but because the pieces fit. Zariah had stepped down from the day-to-day operations of the firm, naming a trusted executive as interim. She still held full ownership, still attended critical board meetings, but she no longer let it own her. Instead, she'd chosen this. A life with Brayden and Sophie. The house had been her idea. Not a sprawling estate, not a penthouse view. Just a home with a backyard big enough for a garden and a porch swing they hadn't installed yet. Brayden pulled 2 stools to the counter and sat, watching as she poured water into a vase for the flowers Sophie had brought in from the yard. "You nervous?" he asked. "About what?" "About this being real." Zariah turned, her gaze steady. "It's not nerves. It's gratitude." He reached across the counter, brushing his fingers against hers. "You gave up a lot." "I gave up control," she corrected. "That's not the same thing." Sophie poked her head around the doorway. "Can I show her the surprise now?" Brayden raised an eyebrow. "You think she's ready?" Zariah looked between them. "What surprise?" Sophie grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back door. "Come on." They stepped into the backyard, where Brayden had spent the last 2 weekends building something he hadn't thought he'd ever have a reason to build again, a treehouse. Nestled in the thick branches of the old maple tree stood a small wooden structure, painted white with blue trim and a tiny sign that read Sophie's Sky Room. Zariah stared up at it, then turned to him slowly. "You built that?" He nodded. "She wanted a place where you could read stories together." Zariah covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful." "She helped," he said, gesturing to Sophie, who was already halfway up the rope ladder. "Only the painting part?" Sophie shouted from above. "He did the scary hammering." Zariah laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded. She leaned into Brayden's side as they watched Sophie crawl through the opening and wave from the window. "I didn't think I could ever have this," she murmured. "Not with everything I've built. Not with what I've lost." "You didn't lose anything that matters," he said. "You just made space for something else." She looked up at him, her voice barely audible. "I love you, Brayden." He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then finally her lips. "I love you, Zariah." The next few weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both new and deeply familiar. Brayden opened a small auto shop with the help of a silent investment. Zariah insisted on no strings, no oversight, just belief in what he could build. She continued to attend select board meetings when necessary, but she was home for dinner every night, reading with Sophie, helping in the kitchen, planting herbs by the back fence. One afternoon, as the sun filtered golden through the living room windows, Brayden came in from the garage to find Zariah standing in front of a canvas by the fireplace. She had started painting again, something she hadn't done since college. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "That looks like the treehouse." "It is," she said. "But with stars this time." "Thinking of showing it anywhere?" She shook her head. "Just for us." Later that evening, as Sophie fell asleep with her rabbit tucked under one arm and a book still open beside her, Zariah and Brayden sat on the porch swing they'd finally hung. "She asked if we were getting married," Zariah said, brushing her foot against the porch boards. Brayden glanced at her. "What did you say?" "I told her you hadn't asked yet." He turned fully toward her, reaching into his pocket. "That's because I was waiting for the right moment." Her breath caught as he pulled out a small, velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring, platinum band, oval diamond, understated and timeless. "This is the right moment," he said. "Marry me, Zariah." Not because it's expected, not because of some grand gesture, but because this is a life I never thought I'd have, and I want to spend every second of it with you. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes." 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and she kissed him slow and deep, the kind of kiss that didn't need an audience or a rooftop. Just 2 people who had stopped running from what they wanted. They married in the backyard beneath the maple tree a month later. Sophie wore a flower crown and carried a basket of petals she tossed with wild enthusiasm. The guest list was small, just friends, a few family members, and neighbors. No press, no investors, no pretense. Zariah wore a simple ivory gown with soft lace sleeves. Brayden wore a navy suit she'd chosen. When they said their vows, she didn't mention legacy or empire. She talked about kindness, trust, second chances. Brayden promised to keep her grounded when the world pulled her higher than she wanted to go. And she promised to lift him when he forgot his own worth. Afterward, they danced barefoot in the grass while Sophie twirled between them. They didn't need a honeymoon in Paris or a yacht in Capri. Their joy was right there, in the quiet, in the laughter, in the life they built from something as small as a sandwich and as big as a second chance. Years passed. The shop thrived. Sophie grew into a fierce, imaginative teenager who painted murals and built things with her hands. Zariah started a foundation for underprivileged young women in tech, mentoring girls who reminded her of herself. Brayden came home every night to the same porch swing, the same woman painting stars into trees, the same daughter who still climbed that treehouse when she needed to think. And in the stillness of their shared life, there was never any question, not once, about what mattered most. Not the money, not the past, just each other, forever.